Today's episode covers the topics of sex, assault, and addiction. Listener discretion is advised. Dan-alyzed, an arts and entertainment analysis podcast. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 2, season 1 of Dan-alyzed, the podcast where we break down topics related to the worlds of both art and entertainment. I'm your host, Dan Hoy, and today's episode is entitled, What a Jagged Little Pill, analyzing the themes of the alt-rock sensation turned Broadway Smash hit. We will discuss the origins of both the original album and the Broadway musical, their socio-political commentary, and their cultural impact. What was the process of developing such an iconic album? How does the musical implement the intensity of the original material? What does the music have to say about society in 2020? We will tackle all this and more on today's episode of Dan-alyzed. So, Jagged Little Pill has had quite the impact over the last couple of decades. I know my mother absolutely adores the album. She loves Alanis Morissette's music. And it really is just a really amazing blend of just experimental rock and this raw, unfiltered emotion. It's a really incredible album. And I know I went back and revisited it after I saw the Broadway show a few weeks ago, and it still works now in 2020. It's really quite remarkable. So a few things about that original album. It was released on June 13th of 1995. It was actually Morissette's international debut. It was her third studio album, but the other two albums had only been released in Canada. So this is the first time that the world as a whole is getting to experience Morissette's music. She started it when she was 19 years old, and she finished it when she was 21. That is so young, but it's the perfect age. It's why the music is what it is. Just raw, unfiltered emotion, rage, insecurity. It's really, really quite remarkable. She co-wrote it with Glenn Ballard, and there's this really, really interesting article that the CBC released called You Ought to Know, an Oral History of Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill. And it consists of interviews with Alanis, Glenn, and all these other people who were involved. So I pulled a bunch of quotes from this because I think it does a better job of explaining its history than I ever could, because it's straight from the horse's mouth. So first and foremost, on the purpose of the album, she had already had two studio albums released, but she wanted to release something new with this one. She says, quote, "My agenda was to be self-exposed and to be as authentic as I possibly could, and I wouldn't stop until that happened." So this album was about her really just expressing her own true self through music, not something that someone else wanted her to be, not something that a studio wanted her to be. And you can really hear that reflected in all the recordings. And this actually goes straight into the process, because this was so fascinating to research. This is really, really cool. So this is from Alanis. She says, quote, "Our ritual was such that we would just get together maybe at noon or 1. We'd go to lunch. We'd have some conversation, some philosophical conversation about whatever the topic was that day. And when we would go into the studio, and often the song would be about that topic." So basically, they're solving all the world's problems at lunch and then writing music to reflect that in the evening. I mean, that's so cool. And Glenn, about that, he says, "We weren't really trying to write something for the radio or for the A&R guy or whatever. We were just writing songs, and I think that's the best thing that could have happened." They were writing it for themselves. They were writing it for their own artistry, and I absolutely love that. This next fact is one of the coolest things, I think, about this album that I discovered. So fun fact, but most of the vocals that you hear on the finished album actually come from their demo recordings. And in the demos, Alanis said that she only ever wanted to do 1 or 2 takes of the vocals, because if she did any more, it would start becoming too polished. She talks a lot in these interviews about how she enjoys an imperfection, and she thinks that it's really beautiful. And so what ended up happening was, as we'll talk about this in a second, but as the album started getting picked up, they were like, cool, let's try re-recording it, let's try to make it a little more polished. And she did, but every time it came back, they're like, no, this isn't as good, this isn't as raw. And what she had to say was, quote, "I think the process for me was really sacred, but it wasn't precious. If I were to have gone in to re-record these vocals, they would have just been very awkward because I already had them, you know? There was a really urgent, visceral, immediate, real-time capturing that Glenn was able to do. They wanted to capture these things in the moment. They wanted it to be just real and exposed, and honestly, I think that's one of the huge reasons that the album was as successful as it was. When they were first trying to get it released, it's interesting because almost every single major record label actually passed on them. They didn't think it was, I don't know if they didn't think it was going to sell or if they didn't think that it was marketable. On this, Alanis kind of just says, quote, "They were just afraid of how intense it was, to be honest. And I would just say, well, I'm 19 and I'm intense." You know, I love that quote. She's unapologetic, and that's what makes it stunning. She eventually did end up signing with Maverick, and then the album was distributed globally, and it was a critical and commercial success. It went 16 times platinum in the US. She was certified diamond, and she was the youngest artist to do so until Britney Spears with Baby One More Time. And it won a lot of Grammys and Juno Awards. People really, really loved this album. They thought it was a fresh take on the genre, something just really raw, really, really real, and not overproduced. And that leads us to the Broadway production. Now, I saw this show a few weeks ago, and I know that I said this isn't a review podcast, but I do just have to say I was really, really blown away by the talent. I thought it was a really, really incredible production. I was super moved by it. If you are in New York or you're coming to New York, definitely go check it out. It's absolutely worth the price of admission. And also, just a little plug here. I have another series called Music Mondays. It's up on YouTube and on IGTV. And I actually did a cover of the song "Uninvited" from the Broadway production. It's the Broadway version of the song. Or close to the Broadway version of the song. So if you want to go check that out, I'd really appreciate it. You can find me on Instagram at musicmonday.danhoy, or on YouTube if you just type in Danhoy Music Monday, it'll pop right up. Anyway, back to the Broadway production. So it was announced in 2013, started workshops in 2014, and then it premiered at ART in 2018 under the direction of Diane Paulus, who then brought it to Broadway very recently, just in December of 2019. A little bit about Diane Paulus. She's the ART artistic director, and she has got quite the directing resume. I mean, she's a really, really incredible woman. She directed the Broadway productions of Finding Neverland, The Pippin Revival, Waitress, and so many more. Really, really remarkable artist. I mean, she's got Tonys, she's got Drama Desk Awards, she's got Outer Critics Circles Awards, just really, really fantastic. The book for the musical was written by a woman named under the pen name of Diablo Cody. Her real name is Brooke Mario. And some interesting stories about her. I mean, she's a fascinating woman, and I kind of just absolutely adored getting to research her. She came up with the pen name while she was traveling through Cody, Wyoming, and listening to El Diablo by Arcadia. At the time, she was writing an adult blog and had just started stripping, which I guess according to the things I read, she went out for an amateur night, decided that she enjoyed it, and just started kind of rolling with it. She actually released a memoir about it called Candy Girl, A Year in the Life of an Unlikely Stripper. Really, really fascinating background. And all the while, she continued to write, and she ended up kind of taking off with Juno. She was a screenwriter on Juno. She also wrote Jennifer's Body, Ricky and the Flash, and she's the creator of The United States of Tara. Really cool woman. It was really fun getting to read up on her. And fun fact, also, she has an Academy Award for Juno. She had a Critics' Choice Award. She has Writers Guild Awards, BAFTA Awards, Independent Spirit Awards. She's got it all. She's really amazing. In terms of the music in the Broadway production of Jagged, it has all of the original Jagged Little Pill album, every single song, including the secret hidden track called Your House. It also includes music from some of Morissette's other pieces, including Supposed Former Infatuation Junkie, Under Rug Swept, Feast on Scraps, Havoc in Bright Light, the Japanese version, and then the film of City of Angels. It also has 2 original songs written by both her and Ballard, and everything in the show is actually orchestrated by Tom Kitt, who you might know as a composer from Next to Normal, If Then, Freaky Friday. Fun fact, he has also orchestrated and pieced together other Broadway musicals and films, such as American Idiot, SpongeBob, Pitch Perfect 2, and so many more. He's another one who has quite the resume. And he is a Tony, Drama Desk, and Pulitzer Prize winner as well. I mean, really just rounding out the remarkable creative team. And so far, in terms of its run, it's very new. I'm recording this in February of 2020. The show only released back in December. So the critical reception has been fantastic. It has been doing very well commercially. We'll see how it does at this year's Tony Awards, but I'm looking forward to its future. So yeah, for today's episode, we're going to be focusing primarily on themes present within the Broadway musical. Just a heads up, there are quite a few spoilers within this analysis because it's kind of hard to talk about these themes and these topics related to the show without revealing plot points and character development. So if you are sensitive to that, just a good thing to note, just a little heads up. The story itself circles around one family, it's the Healy family, and specifically the mother of that family, MJ, Mary Jane, and sort of Mary Jane's relationships with her children, with her husband, and also the external factors that are sort of weighing down on each of them individually. And the plot discusses a lot of different things. There are a lot of different themes, a lot of different topics, a lot of socio-political commentary, and we're going to be getting into a lot of those. But I think at the core of the story, you have this desperation for perfection. MJ in particular wants to have the perfect family. She wants to be seen as the perfect mother. And unfortunately, perfection does not exist. And actually, a lot of that goes back to Morissette's original concept with the original album, which is that imperfection is sort of beautiful and that imperfection is sort of essential. And you find that MJ discovers that throughout the show. So in terms of the specifics that we're going to be covering today, we have 6. We're going to be covering 6 different themes that the show touches upon. Number 1 is family and societal pressure to sort of meet the status quo. Number 2 is race and the nature of adoption, specifically what the show has to say about colorblindness and the white savior complex. Number 3 is sex and intimacy and its importance in maintaining long and healthy relationships. Number 4 is sexuality and gender identity, particularly within youth culture. Number 5 is rape culture and society's view on that in the era of social media and the Me Too movement. And finally is addiction and how addiction is a disease that can impact anyone and everyone, even those people that you are least expecting. So with all that in mind, let's go ahead and jump right in. First, we have family and the pressure from society to maintain the status quo. At the very beginning of the show, this is right out the gate, MJ is writing a letter sort of to all of her friends and family, just, extolling on how great her family is doing. She talks about her son Nick's early acceptance to Harvard. She talks about her husband Steve's promotion at work. She talks about her daughter Frankie's artworks. And then she even talks about the fact that she is healing up very well from this car accident that she had. And everything is good and dandy and wonderful. And the reality is not quite that cut and dry. In reality, Nick is beginning to sort of crack under the pressure that he feels is being put onto him by his parents. Steve and MJ's sex life has completely died, and they are slowly but surely drifting further and further apart. MJ and Frankie are constantly fighting. MJ views Frankie as very rebellious, but in reality, Frankie's just struggling with her own identity as both a person of color and a bisexual woman. And finally, MJ herself is actually addicted to Oxycontin after beginning the regimen after the car accident and having some past trauma reemerge. So what she is putting out into the world is not exactly her reality, but she's putting out there what she wants everyone to perceive her and her family as. She likes to be seen as the perfect mother, and she's having this pressure to sort of maintain that facade. And that desire to put into the world this image is what creates a lot of the tension within the family. For one, you have MJ and Frankie, who are always at odds with one another. Frankie wants to really point out the imperfections in society. She wants to stand up. She wants to speak out. She wants to be heard. Whereas MJ, it's not that MJ wants bad things to happen in the world. It's that she doesn't want to get involved with them directly because she's afraid that if she does, that her opinion is going to piss someone off, and then that's going to ruin this image of perfection that she sort of crafted for herself and her kids and her husband. And right from the get-go, you see the tension between these two emerge. One of the first numbers in the show is called All I Really Want. And in it, right out the gate, Frankie says, do I stress you out? My sweater's on backwards and inside out. And you say, how appropriate. And all the while, she's holding a big protest sign. I believe it's about her period. And her mom is not having it. MJ responds with, I don't like to dissect everything today. I don't mean to pick you apart, you see, but I can't help it. Yeah, that's going to happen a couple times on this one. Sorry, y'all. Talking lyrics is so weird. It takes me back to those classes where they're like, do the song as a monologue, which is a great exercise, but also just like so uncomfortable. Anyway, so yeah, right out the gate, you're seeing within the lyric that these guys are not seeing eye to eye. With her other kid, Nick has sort of always been, in MJ's mind, the image of the perfect son. He had the good grades, he was an athlete, he's gotten into Harvard, he has never gotten into trouble. And she literally tells him at one point, she says, you're literally the only thing that I think I've ever done right. Something along those lines. And to say that to your child is puts an immense pressure on that person. And Nick is really starting to feel it. I mean, he feels like his parents have this expectation of him that he can never quite match up to. And we see this a lot through the song Perfect. He's talking sort of from his parents' perspective of what he believes they view him as. And he says, sometimes is never quite enough. If you're flawless, then you'll win our love. And at the very end, this one just, it hit me really hard when I saw it in the show. He says, we'll love you just the way you are, if you are perfect. He has been very successful, and he has had a great high school career, and he's probably going to go on and do great things academically, and yet he feels as though he can't necessarily have a personal life or have a personality or do other things because he's afraid that if he steps too far out of what the mold that his parents have crafted for him, that he's going to end up losing their respect, losing their love. And you do see, right out the gate, he's starting to question his own abilities. There's actually a point in the first act where there's this party that he wants to go to, and we're going to be talking about this party a lot later. But he comes home and his mom is home alone because Steve is still at work. He has been asked to stay, and MJ's feeling very lonely. So she does, and I don't know if it's inherently intentional. I think that it's that's up to the actor. But it sort of starts to guilt him into staying with her. He says that he wants to go to the party, but she's very clearly feeling lonely, and she's like, no, go. But, with that sort of subtext that, no, like, I really want you to stay here. And he almost does not attend, but strictly because he doesn't want to ruin this image that his mom's created. He doesn't want to let her down. He does not want to let her down. Ultimately, he does go. And the reason we're going to be talking about this party a lot later on in the podcast is because at the party, one of his friends, Bella, is sexually assaulted by another one of his friends, Andrew. And after the assault, he reveals to MJ that he actually witnessed a lot of the events that went down, and that he's thinking about going to the police. And this is what's interesting is MJ pressures him not to. And we're going to be diving into this a little bit more later, but I believe the reason that she really puts this pressure on him is because she doesn't want him to ruin his future. She doesn't want him to ruin this illusion that he is the perfect child and therefore she is the perfect mother. And a lot of that comes from external pressures to sort of maintain this this idea that you have to have the perfect family in order to be respected. So ultimately, the pressure to maintain perfection is what is tearing this family apart from the inside out. So the next thing I want to talk about are the racial issues present within the show, particularly how they relate to adoption, but also how it addresses racism on a greater scale. Two things I want to talk about real quick before I jump into it. Number one, the representation within the show is truly fantastic. It is a very diverse cast. There are African American individuals, Asian individuals, Latino individuals, and it is truly remarkable to see a Broadway show just embracing the diversity of its community. Number two, I am a white cisgendered male. So, while of course I want to talk about these topics because I believe they are very important topics, I cannot claim to fully understand the struggles that people of color go through in this country every day. I cannot claim to understand the struggles that people of color have gone through historically in this country. And so I just wanted to say that a lot of my research on this topic and into this theme have come from writers, from professors, from philosophers, from sociologists who are people of color and who can relate more directly to the topic. Because frankly, if I just utilized my opinion on it, I would be so far off base and it would be so ignorant of me to do so. So I just wanted to say that before we jumped in. We're actually going to be talking about someone very specifically here in a few minutes when we get onto the topic of colorblindness. But yeah, I just wanted to be sure I said that before I started this section. So with that in mind, the sort of vehicle, the center of a lot of the racial issues that are prevalent within the show come through the eyes of Frankie, who we discussed a little bit earlier. She is African American, and she has been adopted by Steve and MJ. And there is some very blatant racism within the community. There's a scene in which MJ is in a coffee shop, and some of her fellow mothers from the community see her and immediately start congratulating her on Nick's early acceptance into Harvard. Saying, oh, like he's worked so hard, he's done all these things, blah, 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 blah. And then one of them says something along the lines of, well, aren't you so glad that you won't have to go through that again? And MJ says, what do you mean? We got Frankie. And they're like, well, yeah, but she's going to get all the minority scholarships and things like affirmative action and blah, 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 blah. And MJ goes, oh, yeah, sarcastically responds with, I'm sure it will have nothing to do with the fact that she's politically active and that she has this incredible artwork and that she's very intelligent. And then there's this moment of tension, and then they all sort of just laugh it off and move on, which unfortunately I think, again, reflects on MJ at this point in the story still wanting to sort of maintain that image of perfect. She doesn't want to be in fights with other mothers. Perfect people don't do that. MJ at that time does not do enough to defend her daughter. And in fact, I don't think that she really sees eye to eye with her daughter until the end of the show when she recognizes that her daughter is a person of color and is going to have these experiences. And that brings us to our first sort of major topic within this section, and that is the concept of colorblindness and how that can be problematic. So MJ very clearly tells her daughter, I never wanted you to be treated differently because of your race. And in doing so, always just sort of treated her as if race were not a proponent of her life, And a lot of Americans will say, well, I don't see color, I don't see race. And there are some major issues with that. While it's typically not done in a malicious way, it tends to ignore discrimination, both systemic and deliberate, and it sort of rejects both cultural and racial history and identity within people of color within the United States. And there's this really amazing article written by a woman named Adia Harvey Wingfield. She is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. She's the author of a multitude of books, including No More Invisible Man, Race and Gender in Men's Work, and Flatlining, Race, Work, and Healthcare in the New Economy. She's also an award-winning scholar and the 2018 president of Sociologists for Women in Society. And I'm just going to quote her directly. She says, quote, "Many Americans purport not to see color. However, their colorblindness comes at a cost. By claiming that they do not see race, they can also avert their eyes from the ways in which well-meaning people engage in practices that reproduce neighborhood and school segregation, rely on quote-unquote soft skills in ways that disadvantage racial minorities in the job market, and hoard opportunities in ways that reserve access to better jobs for white peers." And essentially, what she's saying there is just that in saying that you do not see someone's race, you are rejecting their claims of discrimination within the community because you're saying that, well, since I don't see it, it's not happening, but it is. Discrimination still is very prevalent in 2020. And also, and what ends up happening with MJ and Frankie is that it doesn't allow for that individual to express their own sense of cultural and racial identity. And it limits them in their exploration, especially when someone who is in a position of authority, MJ is Frankie's mother, is telling you, well, I don't see you for your color. I don't see your color. I don't see your race. You're essentially also saying, and therefore that's not a part of who you are. And I think Frankie throughout the show is saying, no, this is who I am. This is who I am. You hear it a lot in Unprodigal Daughter. She's saying, I'm not chained by your, the mold that you've set out for me anymore. And I finally get to go out and explore and express who I am. And her racial identity is a huge part of that. Another thing that they talk about, while the show talks about, and it comes up while MJ and Frankie are fighting, is that Frankie believes that MJ believes that MJ only really adopted her as some sort of, way to garner respect in the community. Oh, she's quote unquote saving the black girl. And it brings up the really interesting topic of the white savior complex. And Frankie says, well, you just wanted to continue your whole perfect family act, and I was just a part of that act. And while I don't believe MJ was ever malicious in her actions, I don't think that she was ever trying actively to do these things. The reality is that her actions in limiting her daughter's identity and trying to make her fit into this sort of more white-centric mold, she did limit her daughter's ability to express herself, and in doing so gave her daughter the idea that you are not enough in your own identity. You have to fit into mine because I saved you. Fortunately, this is resolved by the end of the show once MJ embraces that Frankie's always going to be different, and that's okay. There's this really, really beautiful scene before the song Thank You in which they finally talk out this issue. Where I believe the line is something along the lines of, I never wanted you to be treated differently. And Frankie just says, but I am different. And that's just who I am. And that's okay. And once MJ accepts that, you actually see a lot of the tension between those two characters begin to dissipate. And it's really interesting because MJ really does have a lot of tension with a lot of the other characters in the show, particularly her family members. And that's actually going to bring us to our next major theme, which is sex and intimacy, particularly within long-term relationships. So you have MJ and Steve, who are married but have not had sex in over a year. Steve, who has been feeling very pent up, has now turned to porn, which he watches at his office because he doesn't feel like he can watch it at home. And MJ does not approve of this whatsoever. And it really is starting to push the couple apart. You see it through the song So Unsexy. And the chorus of the song, which they both sing, is I can feel so unsexy for someone so beautiful, so unloved like I'm not on your mind. I can feel so boring, feel so uninteresting, so lonely, but I say that I'm just fine. And that last line in particular is what gets me. It's the end, but I say that I'm just fine. Like, I'm okay. Because they don't want to deal with this topic. And I think in a lot of ways, too, sex is incredibly taboo. It's interesting. A lot of people want it, but no one wants to talk about it. And in fact, Steve gets to the point that he says that he believes that they should go to marriage counseling to start to discuss these intimacy issues and to discuss the cracks in their marriage. But again, MJ wants to maintain this perfect facade, and going to marriage counseling in her mind means that she has to admit that she is not perfect and that this relationship is not inherently perfect. So initially she refuses, and very aggressively so. And then even when they eventually do go, she's not thrilled about it, and she's very short with the doctor. You see that in the number, not the doctor. She doesn't want to open up because she believes that there are things that are meant to be private, and that sex is one of them. That sex is a thing that you can't talk about. And it's interesting because intimacy is essential to a healthy relationship, to a healthy marriage. And one of the key components of intimacy and sex is communication and openness. In fact, Ashley Brown with BetterHelp says that there are 3 pillars to intimacy within a relationship, and that is comfort, communication, and the actual act of sex. Number one, I mean, comfort. Everyone has things that they're self-conscious about, things that they don't necessarily love discussing, but a certain level of vulnerability and honesty with your partner is essential. You have to be comfortable with opening up about those things and being willing to sort of show the things that you may not be the most confident about. And that does lead directly into number 2, which is communication. Once you've gotten comfortable with these things, then being willing to actually open up and discuss them. Whether you have a very high libido or a very low libido, if there are things that you want to try to keep things new and fresh, whether there are things that you're not comfortable with, you need to be open and honest about your sexual and physical needs and desires, because I think it's interesting too, because I think often society has painted this picture of sex and just said, oh, well, in a perfect relationship, you'll just know what your partner wants. And that's not true. We're not mind readers. No one is able to just go, oh, like, I know exactly what you're thinking right now. Like, that's not how life works. But again, unfortunately, sex has become such a taboo topic that people are not willing to communicate on it. They're afraid of being seen as weird or odd or, things along those lines. Finally, the third pillar is the actual act of intimacy, whether that's sex or any sort of other sexual relation. And, she says in the article that she believes that sex is a very important factor in any marriage and long-term relationship, but there are often situations in which one or both partners have sex-related issues. And that can be a variety of things. I mean, that could be a history with sexual assault that has now led an individual to view sex as either dirty or as triggering. There can be anxiety about intimacy and letting someone in. It can be as easy as someone has a higher libido and someone has a lower libido. And the reality is that a lot of these specific issues often do require therapy. They require you to talk to someone, whether it's a personal therapist to talk through your own personal issues, or a couples counselor to sit you both down and sort of open up that line of communication. And it's interesting because you see with MJ and Steve that they're not really able to break down a lot of the walls that are barricading their relationship until they do genuinely embrace therapy as a viable option. And of course, that doesn't come until MJ hits absolute rock bottom, which we will be discussing in just a little bit. So the next thing I want to talk about is sexuality and gender identity within Jagged Little Pill. First and foremost, the representation in the show, again, is fantastic. You have actors who identify as non-binary, you have trans actors, you have lesbian actors, you have gay actors. Everyone is represented within this piece. Everybody's pronouns are in their bios in the playbill, which I've never seen before, but I absolutely love. I think it's just really cool to see Broadway embracing that. I just thought that was really awesome. So yeah, again, shout out to Jagged Little Pill for being on the forefront of that. In terms of the LGBT topics actually addressed within the content of the show, you see a lot of it through the relationship between Joe, Frankie, and Phoenix. Joe and Frankie at the beginning of the show are sexually and romantically involved. They're sort of discovering their sexuality together. Joe identifies as a lesbian, and Frankie identifies as bisexual. And Joe's family situation is really, really disheartening to watch throughout the piece. Her mother is very religious, and she forces her to go to these various gatherings in an attempt to pray away the gay. Her mother forces her to wear more feminine clothing because she thinks that that's somehow going to keep her from being a lesbian. And this lack of acceptance leads to this severe resentment. You hear it in the song "That I Would Be Good," in which Joe just is desperate for her mother to just accept her for who she is. She wishes that she were just good enough as she were, not who her mother wants her to be. And she doesn't really get any validation from her family. Most of the validation that she gets is from her relationship with Frankie, which unfortunately takes a turn when Frankie begins experimenting and exploring her sexuality through her relationship with Phoenix, who does identify as a man. So Frankie goes out and explores her bisexuality, but in doing so, actually ends up hurting Joe, who walks in on her and Phoenix having sex. And it's never entirely established if that relationship was meant to be exclusive, if it was just sexual. But for Joe, it was much more. For Joe, it seems like it was not just friends with benefits. It was romantic. There was something deeper there. And when she walks in on Frankie, I think that her heart and her soul are just both crushed. And you have this really interesting thing within, especially LGBT youth, that are being raised in regions in which being gay, being lesbian, being bisexual is not necessarily socially acceptable. A lot of young people will cling to relationships for escape. You know, they find the one person that accepts them for who they are and that they can be intimate with. But sometimes it ends up being in a sort of very restricting and ultimately unhealthy way. I think that Joe really leaned on Frankie to be that escape for her, but then ends up getting hurt because Frankie wanted to go out and explore her sexuality, which he's absolutely allowed to do, but she felt betrayed. And again, we don't know if it was ever established that it was an exclusive relationship, but because she kind of clung on to it so deeply, she ends up getting hurt. And let me just say, I know that I said this was not a review podcast, but oh my God, Lauren Patton's performance of You Ought to Know, just mind-boggling. She got a 3-minute standing ovation. Just absolutely unreal. And actually, in the same way, Frankie ends up sort of leaning on Phoenix as she's running, when she runs away, thinking like she runs off to New York and then she calls Phoenix. She's like, "Come out here, I love you. Like, we can start our life together," thinking that Phoenix was on the same page. And Phoenix is like, whoa, this is moving way, way, way too fast. I don't know how I feel. And ultimately, Frankie ends up getting hurt. And so it's really interesting to watch that all play out within the show. I'm very happy to see a show that is willing to address sexuality in youth culture the way that this does, and also to have a bisexual character kind of at the forefront. It is becoming more and more socially acceptable, but in terms of sexual identity, I think that bisexuality, pansexuality, things of that nature have been a little bit slower to be accepted by the broader community than gay or lesbian. And it's just nice to see that representation. In the same way that it's really great to see gender identity addressed more so through the casting choices than anything else. But it was very refreshing to get to see that in a show, and to see that reflected both within the cast and within the thematic material of the piece itself. So that brings us to our next topic, and I know that this next topic is incredibly triggering for a lot of people, so I am going to do my best to be sensitive in the way that I talk about it, but I do think that it's incredibly important that we do talk about it, and that topic is rape culture, particularly within the social media age. As I was watching the show, I felt that it was incredibly reflective of current events. The case that came to mind was the Brock Turner case, actually. In the show, there's a girl named Bella who is friends with Frankie and Nick, and she goes to this party, and at the end of the night ends up getting assaulted and raped by Nick's friend Andrew, who happens to be an athlete, and that is an important thing for something I'm going to talk about in just a second here. He takes pictures of her and he sends them around, and the next day the entire school has these images, and she is mocked relentlessly. She's looked down upon. You see a lot of victim blaming. You see she got too drunk. She set herself up. She's a slut. All of these different things being said, and at the same time, almost justifying the rapist. People saying, "Oh, well, he would never do that," or "Oh, he's a good person," or "Oh, he's an athlete who works hard," things like that. The school, in a weird way, sort of sides with him because he is an athlete. There is this something we're going to talk about in a little bit. The valorization of athletes in particularly high school and college is absurd. Not even just high school and college. I mean, you see it all the way up through professional sports. You see it in the NFL. You see it in the NBA. You see it in every other major sport in which abuse and assault comes up. Anyway, it's interesting to see how this impacts different characters in different ways. On the one hand, you have Frankie, who, as soon as she finds out, is the first one to stand up and say that this is wrong, that Andrew needs to be brought to justice, and immediately comes to Bella's defense. But the rest of the family is immensely hesitant. And actually, Frankie calls them out because they walk in on her and Phoenix having sex after Joe leaves. And they're so vehemently against her having consensual sex, and yet they're not willing to stand up and say something about sexual assault. And she calls them out on their priorities and where their beliefs lie and where their morality lies. And in particular, she calls out Nick, who was actually at the party and is friends with Bella, for not speaking out. And initially he does not. He says nothing, and he lets people call Bella a liar. And Bella keeps trying to get in touch with him, but he refuses to see her. And a proponent of that is even MJ speaking in Nick's ear and saying, "You need to stay out of this. This is not your fight, because if you do speak out and you get in trouble and your future gets ruined, then you're not that perfect son anymore." Again, going back to the idea of having to maintain that perfect facade. And it isn't really until Nick tells MJ that he had actually been in the room when it happened and he had done nothing, that MJ opens up to the idea of him going to the police. And it's an interesting thing that they try to dive into in the show, and that's the bystander effect. He did nothing, even though he saw an assault taking place, and he doesn't know why. He doesn't know why. He just stood there. And at the end of the show, even, I mean, he defers from Harvard for a year to really just sit down and think about why he did not take action when he had the opportunity to. And then you have MJ's relationship to the whole thing. Again, initially she's telling Nick to stay out of it, stay out of it, stay out of it. And you end up finding out that another one of the reasons that she's so against him getting involved is because she herself had been assaulted. But unfortunately, she was under the belief that she was at fault for it, which she was not. But she tells herself, "Oh, I put myself in the situation. I was drunk. It is my fault." And it's actually this reemerged trauma that comes up. You find out that it began coming up again after her car accident, but it's what's led her to a lot of her intimacy issues and her struggle with addiction. Um, and it's so unfortunate because this is still such a prevalent issue within our society. We're still trying to get police officers and schools and communities and people in authority to take allegations seriously, to listen to victims. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen very often. In fact, we're still implementing a lot of high school traditions that actually support the ideas of rape culture. I mean, for one, we have completely inadequate reporting procedures and policies. You don't even know where to go to tell someone that this has happened. Um, you have these ridiculous dress codes that particularly target women. Where we're teaching women that they have to cover up their bodies so that men don't ogle at them, and that men won't be distracted, rather than trying to teach men to just respect women. It's something that I've personally never understood. I think that, of course, there is something to be said about teaching people to dress professionally, sure, but it's gotten to the point that it is so one-sided and it is so sexist, and the arguments are always for the benefit of the male student. And yeah, it's not very logical. It's incredibly sexist, and it promotes this idea that women in particular have to protect themselves from men because men can't be held responsible for their actions, when in reality, men should just be taking responsibility for their actions. You also have sex shaming, especially within health classes. You're not getting proper sex education. They're just saying, don't have sex. Sex is bad. You're a slut if you have sex. And what ends up happening is then when someone is the victim of sexual assault, they don't feel comfortable talking about it because they feel dirty, because they've been told by society and by their teachers and by the education system that they're dirty for having this happen, which is just not true. You also have that constant argument that it gets so old when you've heard it enough. It's the boys will be boys. Oh well, they couldn't control it. Like, yes they can. Like, rather than teaching women to cover up and suppress themselves, why don't we just try to teach boys not to rape? I think that's such a simple concept, and it's so sad to see that that's still not inherently commonplace. And then there are a lot of other things, including expectations around certain events and nights in high school. And this is what we talked about earlier. It's the valorization of athletes. Athletes can do no wrong because they're, you don't want to ruin their future. Well, they ruined someone else's in a much deeper and more psychological way. Man, I just went on a full-on rant there. But all of that just to say, the show addresses these issues very directly and vehemently states that we cannot continue to blame victims for their assaults. If someone says no, that means no. I mean, there's a number in the show literally called no, and the lyrics are, "What part of no do you not understand?" If someone says no, that means no. It does not matter if they are drunk. It does not matter what they are wearing. It does not matter what they said 20 minutes ago. If they said no, that means no. And also, if they can't consent, that also means no. There are a lot of cases where people continue to feed other people alcohol, or they give them drugs, or they put them into situations in which they can't necessarily verbalize that they don't want something to happen. But if someone can barely stand up, or if someone is passed out, that does not give you permission to just go ahead and do whatever you want. Now look, I get it. There's a lot of gray area in all this. Things are not black and white. However, the issue that we are currently facing is that people are so quick to just dismiss allegations because of that gray area that victims are not being heard. People do step forward and speak out about their sexual assault. They've been doing so for years, and it isn't until recently that people have even begun to listen to any of that. And what this show is trying to say is that victims need to be heard, victims need to be listened to. Take all allegations seriously and bring justice to those who are committing crimes. Boys will be boys is not an excuse. They're an athlete, not an excuse. Oh, she was drunk, not an excuse. At the end of the day, if there is no consent, there is no sexual act. Period. The end. Now, moving on to our final topic. I just went on a full rant there, so I need to take a breath. Final topic is addiction, specifically how it impacts MJ throughout the show and how that then ultimately impacts her family. As we've talked about throughout this entire podcast, MJ feels this pressure to maintain this facade of perfection for both herself and her family. If her family is perfect and immaculate, then she is this great and amazing mother, and therefore is able to maintain this sort of reputation that honestly relies on the status quo. However, the reality is that her marriage is on the rocks. Her daughter, in her eyes, is rebelling against her. Her son is leaving, and her own sexual trauma is starting to resurface. And so, all of a sudden, the pressure that she is feeling and attempting to maintain this image for herself and for her family leads her to seek out an escape, something to take off the edge. And that escape comes in the form of Oxycontin. She's given opioids after her car accident to deal with her pain. And it allows her this momentary reprieve from the weight that is currently on her shoulders. She says in the song Smiling that she practically is surrendering to this drug. I mean, the lyrics are stunning. I mean, they're beautiful. She says, "This is the first wave of my white flag. This is the sound of me hitting bottom. This, my surrender, if that's what you call it, and the anatomy of my crash. And I keep on smiling, keep on moving. I can't stand still." So despite the pain that she is experiencing, she is moving forward and she is trying to just continue with her life, but she's doing so while relying on the painkillers to get her through. Now, initially, she gets this prescription legally. She does try to game the system a little bit. She goes to multiple doctors who give her multiple prescriptions. But near the beginning of the show, she goes back to try to get that prescription refilled, and the pharmacy says, "We're really sorry, but we can't do that for you. We don't have permission from your doctors, and thank you and goodbye." So she ends up turning to the street to get something that will take that edge off. And she's given counterfeit pills that are actually, we find out later, have been laced with fentanyl. And as she continues to take, she eventually hits a point, or she continues to use, she hits a point where she takes too much, not knowing that the fentanyl's in the counterfeit pills. And she ends up overdosing. And it's one of the, it was in my opinion, one of the most impactful moments of the show. The song is called Uninvited, and there's this dancer who is on the couch with her, just dancing all around her and sort of just acting as like the drug running through her veins, and it was a really, really impactful moment in the show. And this is very reflective of the opioid crisis that we are still currently experiencing in the United States. The CDC says that more than 399,000 people have died from overdoses, including any opioid, including prescription and illicit opioids, from 1999 to 2017. That means almost 400,000 people have died in the course of 18 years due to overdose. That's not just overdoses. That is deaths from overdose. That's a heartbreaking number. And they say that this crisis kind of came in three waves. So the first wave started in the 90s, and you saw that a lot of people were being prescribed opioids for pain management and were getting hooked. And those numbers have been rising quite steadily since 1999. Then the second wave came in 2010, when a lot of doctors would stop prescribing opioids. They started to recognize the addictive nature of them. But then people, instead of just stopping their use, would then seek out alternatives, and they found that alternative in heroin. And it was cheaper, it was on the street, and you ended up seeing a rise of heroin use and death from heroin overdoses. And finally, the final wave started very recently, just back in 2013, and that was the rise of synthetic opioids, counterfeit pills, things laced with fentanyl. People would use those as an alternative to heroin because A, they were cheap, and B, the prospect of just taking a pill was much less scary than injecting. And all of the sudden, you now have this drug that's out on the street that is laced with something that could very easily kill a person. And that's actually what happens in Jagged. She doesn't die, fortunately, but she does get counterfeit pills that are laced with fentanyl. And you find out that the family had no idea that she was using, which is not uncommon. A lot of users become very good at hiding the nature of their substance abuse. And they feel this immense guilt. There's the number Mary Jane, where essentially Steve says, "I had no idea what you were suffering. I had no idea what you were going through. You never let me in, and now I feel as though I've wronged you." Fortunately, she does survive the overdose, and then she does begin treatment for her substance abuse and continues through therapy. And at the end of the show, just to kind of wrap all of that up, she writes this letter where she's just in the same way that she wrote the letter at the beginning, but this time she's just being really blunt and honest. She admits to being an addict. She says that there are all these things that have happened, and she embraces that, just like Alanis Morissette had always claimed, as she was writing the original album and even through today, imperfection is not just okay, but it's beautiful because it's life. Yeah. And I think ultimately that's the purpose of this show. I think it brings up a lot of social topics, and it really fights hard for what it believes in. But I think at the end of the day, the central theme is that we are all different, and that's okay. There is no definition of perfection. We can be imperfect, we can make mistakes, we can be who we are and be comfortable in ourselves, and that's fine. That's beautiful. We are all different human beings. We are all different people. And that's really what made this show so impactful for me. So yeah, just some final thoughts here before I leave you guys. These are all incredibly important topics. These are all things that we are facing in society today. And it's important that we talk about them, that we open up a dialogue about them. You may not agree with everything I had to say here today. And if that's the case, I ask that please tell me so. I believe that dialogue is incredibly important, and starting these conversations and how we can make changes within our society to make everyone feel safe and accepted are important. So yeah, that's first and foremost. Secondly, I just have to say I think it's so cool that Alanis Morissette's music is still so impactful today. This is music that was written over 20 years ago, and yet it applies so beautifully to the issues that we're facing in 2020. Just think that's really awesome. Lastly, I just wanted to throw some resources out to you guys. We talked about a lot of things today that are that can have people in dangerous or life-threatening situations. So I just wanted to just let you guys know of some resources that you can utilize if you are experiencing some of these things. First and foremost, I am not affiliated with any of these organizations, nor am I sponsored by them. These are just organizations that I have discovered through my research that I believe could be helpful to people in these situations. First is an LGBT hotline. If you are experiencing homelessness or abuse due to your sexual or gender identity, just know that there are resources for you out there to get help. The one that I'm featuring in this episode today is the Trevor Project. So you can find their website at www.thetrevorproject.org. Again, that's www.thetrevorproject.org. Or you can call their hotline at 1-866-488-7386. Again, that's 1-866-488-7386. The next one I wanted to touch on is a sexual assault hotline. The organization is called RAINN, RAINN, and that stands for Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. If you are a victim of sexual assault and you are in need of resources to support you, whether it's through therapy or through the judicial process, RAINN has a variety of these resources at your disposal. Their website is www.rainn.org. Again, that's www.rainn.org. Or you can also call their hotline at 1-800-656-4673. Again, that is 1-800-656-4673. And the final resource I wanted to give to you guys is one for substance abuse. If you are struggling with addiction, or you know someone who is struggling with addiction, there again are resources out there to help and support you. This particular one is actually a government agency. It is their website is www.samhsa.gov. Again, that is www.samhsa.gov. And their hotline is 1-800-662-4357. Again, that is 1-800-662-4357. Hey guys, I hope that you enjoyed today's analysis. If you liked what you heard, be sure to follow danalyzed on the podcast platform of your choice, whether that's Spotify, Apple, Google, etc. And be sure to tune in next week for all new content coming at you every Thursday. Also be sure to check us out on Instagram at dan_alyzed. That's spelled DAN_ALYZED. I post updates, previews, discussion topics, and if you have something that you would like to hear on the show, be sure to reach out to that account directly. If you want to keep up with me, you can follow me on Instagram at dan_jhoy. Until next time, my name is Dan Hoy. This has been Danalyzed. Thank you so much for listening, and have a spectacular rest of your day.